Welcome to episode number 77 of the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Tempe. Today we've got Mark Coggins joining us as the third guest in our mini-series on the importance of building the skill of decision-making in individuals and in teams. Mark is co-founder and board director of Cranleigh, China, and is director of KB Financial. Thanks for sharing your talents and insights with us today, Mark.
Hey, hi Andy, great to be here. Really looking forward to taking part in this series, and I just hope for the listeners that I've got a few things to say that make sense, and if they can help in any way in their journey, then that's fantastic.
Well, as a former colleague of yours, I always appreciated what you had to say in the business meetings that we would have together at Kaplan. So I'm sure it's going to be a very informative conversation. So before we get started, we do this on every show. It'd be great if you told our listeners your story.
So I'm a Brit, educated in the UK. I studied economics at University College London. Back in the early 80s. That time, can't say it made a great part in my career, except as a qualification. It was quite a left-leaning university at the time, steeped in Keynesian economics. But I came out of there and then joined one of, at the time, I think it was a Big 8 firm, which then became one of the Big 6 firms, which I think are now the Big 4 firms, and trained as a chartered accountant. Working in business development group, and qualified as a chartered accountant, which gave me certainly the kind of nuts and bolts, which oddly enough, I think a lot of times in education, you don't actually know the benefits of what you're learning until sometime later in life. But even though I didn't ever really think I would go down that route, it's proved to be an incredibly useful tool bag, I'd say, in some of the decision making that has been a feature of my later life. I then actually went into teaching of finance for a number of years, which was a terrific experience actually, and oddly enough, then had huge bearings on the later part of my life. Enjoyed it tremendously. I then became an equity analyst, head of research for Paribas, big in French investment bank, and then HSBC. Moved to Hong Kong, then ran the equity business, so research, trading, sales for HSBC for Asia Pacific until early 2000s. And then big decision actually then went back into kind of education. Approached Kaplan in 2003, 2004, and built quite a substantial kind of education business from China all the way through to Australia, principally focused on professional education and higher education, and also principally focused on really the whole concept of either taking students to the source, i.e. to the US, the UK, or Australia for an education, or bringing Western education into kind of Asia. And we had a huge amount of university partners and professional qualifications and designations. And by 2013, we had about 120,000 students studying at various kind of campuses and facilities that we had through the region. And I guess then that's kind of continued to define what I've done from then, is really around kind of education and with still a big emphasis on really kind of global education and the marrying of, and I'll love to talk about this a little bit in more detail as we go through. But really the kind of whole concept of globalization of education and increasingly kind of learning how what we can do in terms of providing education can be beneficial to, say, a Chinese audience, but also learning increasingly from what they do in terms of producing great students as well. And so I'm now based principally in London. I still have some businesses in China at both the tertiary level and the secondary level in terms of international education.
It's an incredible story. I really like to introduce these global businesses, global leaders to our listeners, and just have them listen to the diversity of stories that leaders on the show can tell, and that's a really great one. If you had to pick one event in your life that just put rocket boosters behind your career, what would that have been?
I think there's two. So I'll mention the two and then maybe focus on one in terms of kind of more detail. So I suppose, I moved to Hong Kong in 1995, 96, and that was a very defining moment in terms of accelerating kind of the possible and also kind of putting oneself in an environment that was slightly outside your comfort zone, and then really kind of saying, well, you can either sink or swim in that environment. And that was without doubt a trigger. I think one that probably was more tangible in terms of kind of what then happened was that I'd worked, as I'd said a moment ago, for Paribas, French investment bank. I then went to HSBC, which in the context of Asia in particular is kind of enormous, and particularly in the context of Hong Kong. Some of your listeners may not know, but HSBC was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. And so having a senior position in Hong Kong in that particular institution was quite significant. What I found is that much as I'd enjoyed my time there, you sometimes know when you're kind of due for a change, if you like, and it had been a hell of a ride. When I arrived in Hong Kong, we had the period up to the handover, which was phenomenal in terms of the impact on Hong Kong. That was shortly followed by the Asian crisis, which was phenomenal, but for a whole different and negative set of reasons and very challenging set of reasons. We then went almost immediately into the dot-com bubble. And then that was shortly then covered by the burst of that bubble. And then it was then followed up by the SARS epidemic in Hong Kong, which decimated the city. So you'd had this just roller coaster of a ride, in which there was many great moments, but also some quite challenging ones. And I sat back and decided that perhaps it was time to kind of look at a change. And it was a difficult one, because going from education to investment banking is relatively easy if you just look at dollar signs. Going from investment banking back into education feels a little more uncomfortable, and particularly when you've got three sons under the age of 4. So the accelerant was really then making that decision to speak to Kaplan, start that kind of whole process, and then really kind of the story, which was amazing. I mean, we set up the business really in Asia, we had a small presence there at the time. I got involved principally around professional education, and I ought to say that the motivation really was I could see huge gaps in things like the CFA in terms of kind of more practical-based financial education in what was still quite an emerging market. And that then kind of triggered a whole process of realizing that there was huge kind of gaps in the education system throughout, and a much more fluid and I think kind of exciting opportunity for filling gaps that the public sector or the kind of, if you like, the institutional part of education wasn't filling. And so we started a whole process of moving from Hong Kong, Singapore, and then up into mainland China. And then the introduction to the whole concept of education being a global provision and a service which would allow students to kind of go outside the UK, Australia, as I was saying to you earlier on, but also then bringing these universities, institutions, and qualifications and the experience of other countries into Asia, was beyond my wildest dreams. And it was a great learning process, but also then allowed me to use my financial skills that I developed at Paribor and HSBC, to build something that I think that I felt very proud of, and I think other people, part of the Kaplan family at the time, felt pretty proud of.
Yeah, I love it, Mark. Kaplan is, it's very, very good experience for me and for many, many of our former colleagues who are now off working with other businesses, in other parts of the world. But I hear that periodically that, joining Kaplan was certainly an accelerant for me, and it's really, really good to hear that it was as well for you. I think it would be beneficial for our listeners for you to maybe dive in a little bit deeper on this business model of transnational education, and specifically what you're doing with Cranleigh, China. There's just, I think, a lack of information and knowledge about the mobility of students across borders.
Yeah, so as I mentioned a moment ago, I mean, I guess I've been actively involved in transnational education almost as long as anybody in anywhere, actually. Back to kind of 2004, 2005. So we're now looking at kind of getting on for 20 years, which is in part kind of depressing, but there you go. And in the period that I've been involved, then you've seen quite a significant kind of evolution. And I think there's important parts of this for all businesses, that a theme can keep in place, but if you don't change within that and facilitating that, then you'll simply kind of die and drop off. And so if you look at transnational education, then it started off very much as a kind of agency-based business. It was agents talking to parents of students and connecting with universities in order to kind of get, let's say, Chinese students to go to US or UK universities. And the people who stayed as agents largely no longer exist. And in fact, back in 2007, we bought as Kaplan an agency business in China. And that business now is kind of effectively Cranleigh China, which is in itself, I think, a wonderful story, because what happened is that we evolved that business over time. So the agency business got replaced by a business that started saying, well, no, you can't just go to a UK or a US university. You need proper preparation to make sure that when you arrive in, I don't know, let's say LA or London or wherever it might be, that you're properly prepared, not just linguistically, but also educationally, in order to get the most out of what is a pretty expensive experience for the overseas student. So what we did is that we started this schools in schools business. So we teamed up with prestigious Chinese high schools. And the Chinese education system is incredibly very merit-based, very score-based. And so as a result, then the schools are numbered number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. There's no kind of names of emperors or disciples or anything like that. They just have a number. And that number roughly equates to kind of where they are in the pecking order. So across a whole range of Chinese cities, we went to school number 1. And if we failed with school number 1, we went to number 2, etc. But we got a clutch of prestigious Chinese high schools. And what we then did is that we embedded an international curriculum within those high schools for students who were looking for a university experience outside China as opposed to kind of China. And that's been, that's been a great story. We've got about 10 of those across a whole range of kind of Chinese cities. But then again, the landscape started changing, because what then happened is that you started getting significant investment and brand names coming into China, essentially kind of moving into our space. So Cranleigh School is a prestigious UK boarding school, which I know is not a peculiar UK concept, but it's I suppose more prevalent in the UK than elsewhere. So it's a top private boarding school based in the UK. And what we do is that we collaborate with them such that we then take Cranleigh schools to various cities in China, some of whom we have an existing school within our school, as I described. Others are kind of new, brand spanking new. And we've now got two fabulous campuses with total boarding school, where the students essentially do, after about 15, 16, they transition into a Western curriculum with a view to preparing them for top schools in the US and the UK.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I just love the whole the mobility of human beings across the planet, and the impact that transnational education, what many call pathways, programs have in introducing individuals to other cultures and other ways of thinking. So, thank you for sharing that with us. Let's dive into the topic at hand, which is decision making. I know we're about 15 minutes in and finally getting to decision making, but there was a method to our madness here. Can you help our listeners understand the process that you go through when faced with making a challenging, multifaceted organizational decision?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, and throughout I'll try and avoid repetition, but I think it's important that I try and contextualize, about real life events that have taken place. Oddly enough, even back to kind of when I was, a reasonably decent equity analyst and stuff, then, I'm always looking for, in the first instance, kind of themes, big things that I believe will have both significant kind of opportunities, but also significant kind of trends over a period of time. So in some ways, I'm trying to kind of swim with the tide. And even better, I'm trying to kind of see that a tide is coming. So
Right.
I'll take international education, but I mean, you could take a whole host of different kind of areas. But my experience is that swimming with the tide as a decision-making tool is an awful lot better than swimming against the tide. And so I've always been very theme-based in terms of kind of what I am looking for in terms of it. So I'll give you another kind of example which might be instructive in this regard. I mean, so we built and ran a very successful higher education business in Singapore. And, the reason why we kind of put significant money to work, significant energy to work in terms of building that was that, if you look at, say, the higher education participation rate or university participation rate amongst G7 countries or developed countries, it trends towards about 50%. In Singapore, it was at 16% in a highly educated population, a highly wealthy population. And so that, or your start point, or my I guess my kind of null hypothesis is that there is no reason why you wouldn't have those kind of participation rates in Singapore. And so as a result, if you look at then kind of the opportunity that presents, then it's very substantial in the context of the Singapore population, because even if they don't get to 50%, they ain't going to stay at 16. And so as a result, you kind of say, well, even if we land somewhere in between, this is something that we should take quite seriously. So always I've tried to kind of think about things that I believe, have got legs that are real kind of stories that you can ride. Now, that's just a start point. And obviously then, in terms of it, it's really then asking myself a series of questions about what are the component parts that we need to put in place in order to be part of that kind of story. And so that really then kind of starts going down to obviously the economics, the data, the facts around it. But that key point for me is always being, whether it's an acquisition, whether it's a starting up of a new business or getting engaged in an area of activity that I'm not hitherto, do I believe that it's a theme where we can swim with the tide? Some other kind of things that I think about in the context of success stories, and not always, they can't always be success stories, is then a deep dive into the real nuts and bolts of what makes these things successful. I'm not a huge fan of USPs. I believe that most successful decisions are a number of small decisions, all of which are a number of small things, which if you take in aggregate and collectively will mean that you are successful. I think it's very difficult, and certainly in the areas of business, or whether it's in my investment banking days or in education, to kind of have one single thing that kind of defines you as a successful business. And I think seeking that kind of one nugget often means that you will go horribly, horribly wrong. And so that means that you've got to be very honest about your own capabilities, and you've also got to be honest about kind of your competitors' capabilities. You've also got to kind of think about, I think, very carefully the kind of component parts of success. And one of the things that you often find in education, and I'm sure, again, this is true in a number of different industries, is that people overrate the importance of kind of product over and above distribution. And so there's many times where you've got great kind of products that aren't successful. But that doesn't mean to say that a great product isn't important, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. And so it's really then around kind of saying, have we got the right bits in place all the way from kind of distributing to delivering in order then that we can make an economic return? And then lastly, what I would also say, I think within this is time. Time can be a great killer of great businesses. And I would say one of the kind of times where, things haven't gone as well is where timing has killed you. And this can be in my start point in terms of theme and riding a tide. If you go too early, you can be sitting there twiddling your thumbs for years, and then you've got to have a very tolerant and a very kind of supportive backer to kind of allow it to flow through. But then if you're too late, but I'd still say I'd rather be too late than too early, because ultimately, if you've got a theme, you're not doing it you're not going to be the only person who does that. And it's then about how do you do it better? And this, Andy, from your own experience, there's nothing necessarily kind of rocket science about providing great shooters, great materials, but it's doing all of those component parts incredibly well and constantly asking yourself whether you are doing it better than anybody else.
Yeah, I love how you've identified delivery, that you can get lost in product, and timing of your decisions is also critical. Mark, we're gonna take a short break for a very quick commercial for our listeners, and we'll be right back. Thanks for listening to the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andrew Temte. In my book, Balancing Act, Teach, Coach, Mentor, Inspire, I explore the characteristics required of leaders who must find balance between strength and vulnerability, confidence and selflessness, passion and measure, and leadership and followership. Balancing Act is available today at Amazon.com. And we're back with Mark Coggins discussing decision-making in the workplace, transnational education, all sorts of great topics today. Mark, is there a mentor, former boss, or colleague that, in your opinion, had just outstanding decision-making skills? What set them apart from everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've been very fortunate through my career to have worked for and with a huge number of very talented people. I just pick out a few, and I'm conscious of time, but I'll pick out a few. Number one, and this isn't necessarily either chronological or in terms of kind of a ranking of them, but there's a couple who I would cite in terms of their attributes. One's a guy called Stuart Gulliver, who was my boss at HSBC, who ran capital markets at HSBC, and indeed became CEO of HSBC globally. And he had the attribute of strength in his decision making, a great ability to be able to capture huge amounts of complex information and synthesize into a relevant decision very rapidly. And in a global investment or a global bank or financial institution the size of HSBC, you're pulling all kinds of bits at all points in time. And he was unbelievable. I've never seen anybody be able to kind of take all of these bits and kind of synthesize it in the way he did. He then was very strong in then kind of having the courage of his convictions, but also then, and I think this is very crucial, is to kind of look at his bench strength and say, have I got a handful of people who I don't have to, as long as they get where I'm coming from and where my direction is, have I got a bench of people who then can go and make that happen? And, decision making, I think, is clearly kind of crucial, but it's also needs to be seen in the context of then those other bits that kind of, so you're then making a decision about the right people. The big decision is this directionally the right way to go? But also then kind of very importantly kind of saying, is this doable with the kind of resources that I have? And coming from a service-based industry, that really in the end tends to be kind of very dominated by the right individuals. And indeed, I would say Jonathan Greer had similar kind of attributes at Kaplan, albeit on a slightly smaller platform. But again, that asking the question, the decision, have you got a bench that can make that happen? Because ultimately you can't do it yourself. You have to kind of rely upon and not feel as though you have to kind of take everyone through every single minutiae and detail. And so he was phenomenal. I've never seen anybody be able to capture that complexity, make a decision, stick by it, and then kind of set people on their way just by saying that is our direction, and then giving them the bench or the elbow room to make their own decisions within the context of the overall kind of picture.
Yeah, Mark, I just want to jump in quick here. The synthesis, the courage of conviction, and the people part. Those are just boiling what you said down to those three components. Our guest last week, Dan Flynn, talked a lot about courage of conviction, but that skill of synthesis is one that we don't talk about enough, I don't think.
No, and it's really, really important. But I'd also say, in the courage of convictions, it's also the courage to kind of know when it's not right. And I would really emphasize to any listener is that sometimes, it felt all right, but all of a sudden, maybe the tides changed, maybe circumstances have changed, and it's then being strong enough to say what seemed a terribly good idea at the time, all of a sudden doesn't make sense. But also, I think in the context of people, if you've made a mistake and your bench isn't strong enough to execute on that strategy, then you've got to act quickly and decisively and make the relevant changes. And don't think as a leader that you're necessarily having to you can't plug that gap. Or you can plug some of it, but you can't plug all of it.
Yeah. So, Mark, I love to talk about skills on this show. And you have experience in both higher and professional ed. Can you name 2 skills that our listeners can and should hone to become better decision makers?
The first thing I would say about decisions, regardless of higher professional or so on, but I do think it's really, really important, is make decisions before you have to. And I say this from both the upside and the downside, because as I kind of talked about a little bit earlier in our story, in the evolving, or the way that transnational education has evolved, is that if you're not constantly asking yourself is what's the new thing, what's the next thing, what should we be doing, then you will either be left behind or you will go out of business for sure. So it is much easier to make decisions in the good times than it is in the bad times. And what I would also say is that if you're not making those decisions ahead of time, and the decisions can sometimes be do nothing. That can in itself be a decision to say, you know what, it's too early. We don't want to go there. We don't want to spend. Let's wait and see for a bit. That is a decision, in my opinion. But the central point is always think about making decisions. Don't wait till you have to make a decision. And on the downside, and I've seen this in my own businesses, but I've also seen it in businesses that I've been part of, is that when decisions are made, when things are going down, you will inevitably make bad decisions.
Oh, that is just wonderful. I think that a lot of people would say, "Oh, that's not a skill, Andy," but being able to be proactive, to not wait until the last minute, because I fully agree with you that making decisions when things are not going well is very hard and very hard to recover from. So thank you so much for sharing that with our listeners. So again, Mark, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Andy Tempty. This is the Balancing Act podcast. You can find us on all the major streaming services, as well as find this episode out on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, rate, share. Sharing is the most important. Subscribing right after that, and then drop us a rating. Thank you so much for listening today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.